This is the story of Saint Emu Nerona, a story that has already been put on page for us by Eiichiro Oda, and yet a story that doesn't translate into English. Which is why a huge part of this video references the insight of the channel Dawn and Dusk, a native Japanese speaker who specializes in breaking down the surprisingly huge details that get lost in the English translation. And as it turns out, we have been missing so much about Emu. So here's some important clarification on the status of exactly what Emu is. It's a very popular theory in the English-speaking fandom that Emu could in fact be a child, mostly because of his very tiny stature sitting on the empty throne and such, the generally slender nature, and the fact that he speaks in the third person in Japanese. Emu refers to himself as Mu, which is the kind of adorable thing that a Japanese child may or may not do. As a quick side note, with the flooding having been confirmed, it's also quite on point that Emu chooses to adopt the name of a hypothetical lost continent, Mu, because that's very much the role that Emu fulfills in One Piece. This gigantic lost piece of history that still lingers on in the dark. As a fun note, almost every world noble in the series speaks with this sort of adorable speech. So for example, the classic way to say I in Japanese would be watashi. But a lot of the world nobles incutify this by saying wachi-shi or even wachi-ki, which is just, it's stupidly adorable. And something that unfortunately doesn't translate into English, which is why they don't even try. And I do think that's unfortunate because it's a very deliberate move by Eiichiro Oda to contrast the horrors that are the world nobles with the cute phrasing of children. Because we need the world nobles to be as far away from reasonable adults as we can. And they do a couple of other odd Japanese sounding things that portray them as just complete whack jobs. Hence the child emu theory, because he does do this to some extent. But the child idea really took off when some gloriously creative mind compared Emu to Max from the book Where the Wild Things Are, where Max ends up becoming king of the wild things, much like how Emu is now the king of the monstrous entities that are the 5 Elder Stars. And also he himself, because we've seen him turn into a monster. But Dawn and Dusk confirms that Emu is portrayed as quite a sophisticated adult due to his speech patterns. Because here is a really fun thing that I love about Japanese. Two people can say the exact same words, but portray entirely different meanings based on how those words are written on page. In Emu's case, he uses complex adult kanji, whereas child characters tend to speak in much simpler hiragana and katakana, which includes Luffy, by the way. Luffy's dialogue is my favorite to read in Japanese because, being real, it's the only dialogue I can read. My Japanese is not good, and Luffy speaks like a child, a young child, which is very much my level. And although it is possible for a child to act like an adult, which we have an example of in the case of Momonosuke, he often uses complex kanji, but it usually slips back into necessary basic hiragana in order to indicate his age and inexperience. And this time, I want to give a positive shout out to the official English translation, because while it does often get accused of using overly florid language for certain characters, in the case of Emu, this is incredibly appropriate, and I've never personally held the impression that Emu was a child, or at least didn't have the mind of a child. In terms of body, I guess anything goes at the moment. That's the fun of silhouettes. And here's the fun of magical fruit, specifically the Ope Ope no Mi. Something that I really appreciate being cleared up by Dawn and Dusk is what Blackbeard said in chapter 1081 about Trafalgar Law's devil fruit, the ultimate ability of which often gets confused for immortality. In the Viz translation, Blackbeard uses the term eternal life, which is vague enough that it doesn't really help, but the source text isn't much better, because the original Japanese magazine release of that chapter flat out used the word immortality, but then later changed the dialogue for the official volume release. So what the Ope Ope no Mi does can more accurately be described as agelessness. They're very specific about that. It stops your aging, but you can still die via non-aging based methods like swords and stuff. And the reason why going into that was relevant is because it is incredibly likely that Emu has lived since at least the Void Century and had this operation performed on him. And this isn't just speculation from fans, it is speculation from Emporio Ivankov of all people, who made this very clear connection in chapter 1086. Sabo, you said the name Emu earlier. This is going to sound very strange, but amongst the first 20 who created the world 800 years ago, there was a monarch named Saint Emu of the Nerona dynasty. He then whips out his trusty devil fruit encyclopedia and does a bit of a point at the Ope Ope no Mi. Look at this. It said that the means to create everlasting life exist in the world. Well, someone has to have proved it. Someone out there has been living for ages and ages without dying. So narratively, this is Oda spelling out to everyone in the back who probably haven't been paying attention that this is what happened to Imu. And sure, maybe it's a red herring to make us think that the Ope Ope no Mi was involved, but sneaky Oda has other plans, but I don't know, I don't think so. Because while the characters in One Piece aren't always reliable, it is very consistently a series where Oda generally has characters speak truth to the audience, regardless of whether the characters themselves know that truth or not. And then comes a question. The question of why Imu was the only founding king of the world government to have had the Ope Ope's ability used on him, as surely other kings would be pretty keen on that sweet, sweet eternal life. And this is where Dawn and Dusk propose something that I had never thought of, because I just don't have the linguistic skills to put two and two together. This idea is that Imu was actually afflicted with a disease similar to the sapphire scales or amber lead syndrome. And the reasoning behind this is because Imu is also a verb in Japanese, which means to avoid, and can specifically be used to speak in avoidance due to ill omens, taboo practices, or general superstition. Now, this could be a reference to the great taboo that Imu himself is committing, which is sitting on the empty throne. That's a bit of a no-no, as Stelly found out when he engaged in premature self-satisfaction after seeing the empty throne and then made it his goal to attain. However, there could also be a much more tragic element involved. Something that very much takes me back to the story of Baby 5 and how she got her name, being that her parents cared so little about her that they couldn't even be bothered to give her a name, and she was just baby number 5. Imu could be in a very similar situation, because I would personally offer the idea of a Jewelry Bonnie style tragedy where a child was born with an affliction, and so the parents simply named him Imu. They named him Avoid because they wanted nothing to do with him due to the condition, and they also needed to warn others about the disease. So the name Imu is a warning. Avoid. They named the child Avoid and potentially abandoned him, which put Imu on the more evil part of life, and after being made ageless, he rose to become king somehow. In this scenario, I'd have to imagine that Imu was born into a ruling family which was referred to as the Nerona dynasty, and I think that would make sense, because for the sake of keeping up appearances, you really don't want your royal family contaminated. But that may also be why Imu remains hidden from the world, and why Oda keeps him hidden from the readers, so as not to show the markings of the disease. And this may also explain why Imu was so keen on destroying the ancient kingdom, because we've encountered a situation like this twice in One Piece with two Worst Generation members. In Trafalgar Law's case with Amber Lead Syndrome, it was incurable without magical fruit powers. Law ate the Ope Ope no Mi and was then able to cure himself with the combination of his medical knowledge. But for a strictly science-based approach, Jewelry Bonnie sapphire scales could be cured. However, it took the brightest mind on the planet, and even then the cost to do so was prohibitively expensive. So expensive that Kuma had to pay for Bonnie's treatment with his ultra-rare Buccaneer blood, as well as his likeness rights and probably even merchandising rights to create a series of Pacifista clones. And then when they become popular, the world government could start selling Pacifista action figures at outrageous retail prices. So POV, it's 800 to 900 years ago, and you are born with, for argument's sake, sapphire scales. Sorry, not a great start to life. And given that it's 800 to 900 years in the past, the medical system, mate, it is even less equipped to deal with your impending death. So you travel around the world searching fruitlessly, pun intended, for a cure. But there is one hope. You, child Imu, have heard tell of a great kingdom, a location with scientific knowledge so advanced that it may as well be sorcery. So if anyone has a cure for your disease, it's them. But you arrive at the ancient kingdom and they have no incentive to help you. The procedure to cure your disease is like mega expensive, and they can't spare the resources because they're too busy furthering science and mankind and all of that. So they turn you away, and you're pretty upset about this situation. You silently vow to yourself that if you, child Imu, were to ever become king of the world, then you're going to make it your mission to wipe each and every one of these demons off the planet. But finally, there is some good news. A lovely young lady by the name of Nefertari Lily makes an appearance and takes to you like a Rocinante to a law, and just so happens to know that there may be a possible cure in the form of a magical heart-shaped fruit. Lily then takes child Imu to a renowned miracle doctor who has consumed the fruit, but oh no, not even the powers of the Ope Ope no Mi are strong enough to remove whatever is causing this fatal disease. But the doctor in question doesn't give up. Sure, he, she, or it cannot cure the condition, but a little bit of creative thinking later, the doctor decides that they can use the fruit to make Imu ageless to counter the most dire consequence of his condition being, death. But we're really pushing the boundaries of this fruit. And the perennial youth surgery, it does succeed, but at a great cost. Unknown to the doctor, this process process would drain so much stamina that it would claim the doctor's life. And this tragic moment is what spawns the legend of the Opi Opi no Mi's immortality operation, and why, to this day, the ability is logged and very publicly available in the Devil Fruit Encyclopedia. But it could even have a much more tragic one-piece twist, like maybe a retainer of Imu who is banished with him chooses to sacrifice themselves to perform the operation. And this could explain what seems to be Imu's small body. Because to use sapphire scales as an example again, that was a disease that Bonnie had from birth, and it was said that she wouldn't live to see her 10th birthday. Law with Amber-Led syndrome was very similar. He was not going to live long enough to become an adult. And so if Imu was granted agelessness to combat the disease, then we do have an explanation for his seemingly teeny tiny body. I keep saying seemingly because Imu is so hard to judge in terms of size. We only really see him in comparison to already oversized objects. So that could just be giving the impression that he's tiny. He might actually be massive. But there could also be horrifying connections to sapphire scales, because Ginny was infected with that disease on purpose by Saint J. Garcia's Saturn. But where did Saturn find this disease / how did he conjure it? Well, if Imu actually had it or a variant of it, then that's a pretty easy source of infection right there. And the reason why Saturn may have been experimenting on humans was to ultimately try and find a cure for Imu, which is also why Saturn may have been incredibly accommodating to Vegapunk and Kuma, knowing that he could go on to use this process for glorious Lord Imu. And now that Imu is free of that accursed condition, it is time to seek out Lily, who is admittedly a couple of centuries too dead. Okay, that's fine. There's plenty of other lily-shaped fish in the sea that Imu have created by flooding the world. So you know what? I'll settle for a Vivi. Then we'll get married and, I don't know, sex, ? I mean, what else do you really do at that point? But we're really getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. The idea is that Imu held a grudge against the Great Kingdom and even considered them genuine demons for not helping him. Then he slid on back into the DMs of the Nerona dynasty, who he also wasn't particularly pleased with for ostracizing him, and plotted to murder each and every one to eventually become the king of the kingdom place. And then it was off to war with the Great Kingdom. At some point, Imu acquires Uranus, and then perhaps goes pew pew a few times, and then says to every other kingdom, hey guys, I can't believe that bad Great Kingdom used a super weapon to massacre all of that stuff. I think someone needs to stand up and stop them. So what do you say, Mina-san? And the nation of Alabasta was of course part of Mina-san, now led by Nefertari Lily, who initially believes Imu and joins the 20 Kingdom Alliance. But along the way, Lily discovers the horrifying truth and defects, which is why Alabasta now sits in this awkward state of both being aligned with the world government, but also supportive of the Joy Boy. And in order to avoid being Leluciad, publicly the kingdom needed to support the world government. But privately, they supported their monarch Nefertari Lily, because Alabasta loves their royalty. And so they even allowed her to hide a cheeky mystery cube with the rest of the dead kings. And just on that, there's also a fascinating sub-theory that Nefertari Lily was the original owner of Bartholomew Kuma's Devil Fruit, and that's how she was able to scatter the poneglyphs across the world. That, or she knew someone else who did, because otherwise that would have been a logistical nightmare. Either way, Imu himself is feeling a little bit betrayed and spends the next 800 years thinking to himself in the shower about what he could have said to keep Lily by his side. But instead, he has to settle for a portrait and a vat of regret, because sure, he got his revenge, but at what cost? And then we have the issue of agelessness, which meant that Imu had to disappear, or people were going to start to ask questions like, why isn't that child getting adulted? And speaking of questions, I have another, because we now know exactly half of the 20 founding family names. We have Nefertari, Vigeland, Don Quixote, J. Garcia, Marcus Topman, Ethan Baron Shepherd, Man Mayer, and of course, Nerona. All of which now have descendants carrying on those names. So what I want to know is, are there any modern day Neronas? Does the Nerona dynasty still exist? Are there any children of Imu, Imlets, if you will? Or as far as the world is concerned, is this dynasty dead? Because it would be pretty wild for someone to be revealed as a direct descendant of Imu. Someone like St. Charles, for example, whose family name we still have yet to learn. And something interesting that I learned about the Nerona name is that it's written in katakana, Nerona. And when you put all three of those characters together, they form the kanji for God. So Imu's surname is just God. And here's a bonus little bit of native insight into our very own Monkey D. Luffy, which actually comes to us courtesy of Whoop Slap. One of the reasons why I love Whoop Slap so much is because he's a character who people forget and for some reason seem to think is named Wood Slap. Please stop doing that. But I also love him because he is a small, completely insignificant character who just so happens to know a big and very significant world-changing secret. Because all the way back in chapter 96, when he and Makino see Luffy's first bounty, look, Whoop Slap, he's not thrilled with what's happening here. To which Makino says that it was Luffy's dream, and Whoop Slap replies, his dream or his destiny? I have always loved this line, but the meaning, again, it's very much lost in English. In Japanese, there are two major words for destiny, being unmei and sadame, with unmei referring to fortune and misfortune outside of someone's control. Sort of like being blessed or cursed, but not directly writing someone's destiny. Meanwhile, sadame means an unavoidable, predetermined fate, and that is the word that Whoop Slap used in chapter 96, indicating that Luffy's journey, which began long before chapter 1 of the series, even before the Void Century with Joy Boy, and perhaps even before the sun god Nika made a mark on the world, is all unavoidable destiny. So thanks again to Dawn and Dusk for providing a lot of the insight that led to the madness of this video, and definitely check them out if you enjoy breakdowns of cross-cultural semantics. It's much more interesting than it sounds.